So, thank you. In case any of you all were not convinced this morning about how blessed I am as a professor with great students, I have two more coming up to do a presentation on some of the groundwork about this project, to lay the groundwork for the next panel about policy and science issues. So we have Emily Tucker and Patrick Harner.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Tucker, and I'm here with Patrick Harner. We're students at the Virginia Coastal Policy Center at the William & Mary Law School. And today we'll be presenting our research on the different scientific and policy implications of HRSD's groundwater injection project. And before I begin, I'd also like to give credit to Alexa Pecht, another law student that worked with us this semester on the project. And I'd also like to give a short disclaimer. A lot of the information in these slides is somewhat duplicative of the presentation you just heard. However, we're looking at the information from a different approach of more of the scientific and policy issues and highlighting them to really set the stage for the panelists that will be talking at 2 p.m. So we hope you learned something new. So before getting into the details of HRSD's proposal, it's important to look at some of the challenges facing the Virginia coastal plain. One of the largest is the groundwater supply depletion. The Potomac Aquifer is the largest drinking water source in eastern Virginia, and it is currently being overdrafted at an unsustainable rate, both by large industrial users like paper mills and by small individual well owners in the aggregate effect. As the groundwater supply is depleted, the pressure within the aquifer decreases and the aquifer itself compacts, causing the land above it to sink, which contributes to land subsidence. USGS reports this is occurring at rates between 1.1 and 4.8 millimeters per year. And this, in combination with sea level rise occurring at about the same rate, poses a severe threat to our low-lying coastal areas. Additionally, as the pressure is reduced within the aquifer, the force exerted in the freshwater zones of the aquifer is less force is exerted against the saltwater zones, and as a result, saltwater can actually be leached into the freshwater zone of the aquifer and contaminate the water supply. And finally, as Ted Hennepin mentioned, the Chesapeake Bay has these total maximum daily load requirements set by the EPA. And right now, the Chesapeake Bay is meeting these requirements, but as the EPA is going to ratchet them down soon, some affirmative steps will have to be taken in order to allow them to comply to the more stringent standards. So here's just a graphic. I apologize it's not bigger. Just so you can see the severity of the groundwater depletion. Up in West Point, the water level within the Potomac Aquifer has dropped by as many as 50 meters. So this is clearly a very severe issue. So as Ted Hennepin said, the HRC's proposal is to treat wastewater to drinking water quality standards and inject it underground. The project should be fully online in 2030 and recharge the aquifer at a rate of 120 million gallons per day. Now, while the project is not supposed to be fully online until 2030, many of the benefits of the injection will be immediate, including replenishing the aquifer, the groundwater supply, and increasing the pressure within the aquifer, which will in turn abate further land subsidence and saltwater intrusion. Additionally, the system will involve 6 or 7 wastewater treatment plants with multiple injection wells at each site. And it's also important to note that because the water that's going to be injected would normally be treated to a lesser degree and discharged into surface waters, this will allow Chesapeake Bay to meet its further stringent TMDL requirements. So now I'm going to discuss a few of the scientific implications of groundwater injection. The first is sort of limitations on land subsidence recovery due to aquifer compaction. So you can see in the graphic on your right that the Potomac Aquifer consists of sandy, gravelly, porous regions where most of the water resides in between these impermeable clay layers. And as water has been withdrawn from the aquifer, the clay layers compact. And because they're relatively impermeable, they cannot really be restored to their original size. So as a result, I think from USGS experts say at least 60% of the compaction of the aquifer is not going to be recoverable. But this is not a downside for the project because at the very least, further land subsidence and compaction can be abated. So now I'll get to the more contentious issue of the project, which is sort of balancing treating water to ultra-pure standards that gets rid of public health concerns like pharmaceuticals and microplastics from personal care products like traces of your deodorants and your shampoos, while maintaining water that is compatible with the native groundwater. So the reason this compatibility is so important is that if you inject water of a different alkalinity or pH, mineralization can occur in the aquifer. So the best way to think about this is if water were to be injected that had too little of, say, iron ions in it than the native groundwater, the groundwater system would try to equilibrate itself back to its natural state. And as a result, iron ions from the clay layers would be leached out into the groundwater. And if this sort of over-equilibrates, the concentration of iron is all of a sudden too high, and this degrades the water supply. Further, metal ions that are leached out into the groundwater can then be precipitated onto the injection equipment and prevent further recharge of the aquifer. So now I'm going to move on to how HRSD sort of handled this balance. So they're doing, this is based on an older SWIFT presentation. There's been some modifications that were in the presentation today. But at the time, they were trying 3 different treatment methods. It's not really important that you know the scientific name, but I will say that all of the methods have been shown to be state-of-the-art and capable of removing the public health concerns like pharmaceuticals and microplastics. Additionally, it looks like now they're focusing more on the carbon versus reverse osmosis approaches, but as they said, the carbon-based approach produced water that was largely compatible with the native groundwater, whereas the reverse osmosis approach produced water with too few salts, and so they had to add these back in at the end. So this may be a cost-limiting step that drives them to choose the carbon-based option.
Thank you. So as Emily mentioned, a lot of what we're trying to do is to prime the panel and to identify some of the policy issues. And those policy issues come in kind of 2 forms. One is policy issues with doing the project in the first place, but also what then the state can do to help the project go more smoothly and so that the benefits are felt by the community a little bit more easily. And to understand the groundwater benefits, you really have to understand what our current regulatory framework is. So just a brief overview of that. In Virginia, as most of you know, we don't charge based on volume of groundwater withdrawal, as some states do. But for the highest level users in Eastern Virginia, there's 2 groundwater management areas, and in those groundwater management areas, of which Eastern Virginia is one, the highest users have to apply for a permit, and then those permits can specify a maximum amount of withdrawal. And the permits are partially based on expected use, but then they're also based on this 80% drawdown requirement or criterion, which basically says that you don't want to draw down the aquifer below what represents 80% of the level from the historic aquifer. So water level compared to the historic aquifer. And those permits are assigned based on their 10-year permits. Now, the reason I set that up and its relevance to the SWIFT project is one of the big drivers of the project is that we've kind of over-allocated. The recharge into the aquifer is not meeting the withdrawal from the aquifer, and so there's been a series of cuts to some of the highest permitted users. A great example that's very regional, James City County was lowered from their permit from 8 to about 4 million gallons daily, and they use about 5. So they're looking at 120 to 130 million project to kind of get groundwater elsewhere. And that's pretty bad in Virginia since we have it both in statute and regulation that we should prioritize domestic or personal use as compared to business use. And James City County is the largest domestic user, but there are other businesses who aren't permitted because they're not using that much. And HRSD offers a big solution to that because they're adding to the aquifer. But something that has to be kind of understood about that is it's a long-term benefit. So since the injection's not even set to be full scale until 2030, the permits are also 10-year permits. So depending on when we start seeing real effects to the pressure as a result result of reinjection, there could be an even greater lag to when those are reflected in the permits for someone like James City County who's trying to plan long-term for where they're going to get their water out of. So we should start to think about what the state might maybe do to make the permitting more reflective of the benefit to the aquifer. So how is this all going to be done? We've talked a lot about chemistry concerns, matching the aquifer content, human health concerns, but how is that all currently done? Well, under the Safe Drinking Water Act, the UIC permitting program was mentioned. That's one of two big protocols for controlling groundwater. And it basically kind of acts like the discharge permits, where if you plan on injecting something into an underground source of drinking water, you have to apply for a permit. And the permits dictate minimum safety levels for about 90 contaminants, but also there's a running list of EPA kind of watch list contaminants that could also make it into that. So it's not a static list. EPA is constantly monitoring what current technology can meet and, you know, emerging contaminants that weren't necessarily known decades ago. So that's all run by the EPA. There's also monitoring standards and, you know, well parameter standards. But this can also be done by the state. So states can apply for primacy. Virginia has not. On this, I don't know that I have a pointer here, but all of the green states on that map, there are states that do have primacy. A lot of states applied for primacy pretty early on. There were some better financial incentives for states to do so. But if a state wants to be able to control itself what is being injected, now they have to use at least minimum federal requirements, but if a state wants to go above and beyond to address the specific needs of that state for either health or environmental concerns or, you know, land use concerns in terms of what's being injected or the well parameters, they would have to apply for primacy. And it's a fairly arduous task to do so. You need EPA approval, governor approval, and the state has to demonstrate that they have a plan in place that could actually handle it in an equivalent level to the federal system. And oftentimes that's a back and forth with the EPA. There's an application process and the EPA might say that the state needs to do X, Y, and Z, and they'll send it back and it'll go back and forth.
So as Virginia considers the HRSD's proposal, it's important to look at what other jurisdictions have done around the country that have established groundwater injection projects. So probably the most established and well-known project is the Orange County Water District Groundwater Replenishment System. We have an expert in the audience about this particular project, so I hope he doesn't call me on any of this. But the project began in 1976 due to saltwater intrusion and groundwater depletion in the aquifer beneath Orange County. In response, they built a 100 million gallon per day treatment facility, implementing membrane filtration, reverse osmosis, and oxidation to treat the water before injecting it underground. The Orange County Water District regulates water withdrawals through a well permitting system. Wells have to be permitted annually, and there's a replenishment assessment which charges users based on how much water they pump. Additionally, the Orange County Water District has the authority to raise the fees in times of drought to incentivize water conservation. Another notable project is the Hueco-Bolson Recharge Project in El Paso, Texas. This project began in 1986 due to severe depletion of their groundwater supply. This is a much smaller scale facility, only 10 million gallons per day, implementing a very intensive 20-step treatment process. And the El Paso water utility regulates well withdrawals through a well permitting system, a fee structure that penalizes high consumption, and a rebate system that incentivizes replacement of old inefficient water fixtures with new ones. And finally, one of the most state-of-the-art projects in the United States is the City of Scottsdale Water Campus in Scottsdale, Arizona. This project was initiated in 1998 due to groundwater overdraft, largely due to irrigation to water all the golf courses out there. This is a 70 million gallon per day treatment facility using ozonation, microfiltration, reverse osmosis, and ultraviolet disinfection. Regulation is done at the state level in Arizona through a well permitting system and an annual volume-based groundwater withdrawal fee. So I think the important thing to take away from these projects is that groundwater injection has been done safely and successfully. And I think the important thing to note is the commonalities between these jurisdictions that can give some insight to Virginia on what makes these projects successful. So I think the main commonality is that all of them have a consumption-based withdrawal fee. Virginia does not have this sort of thing to incentivize water conservation, so it's something that the state should consider moving forward.
So I apologize to Alexa. This was her portion of the project, and if I butcher it, it's my fault. Just to highlight a few of the waste load allocation issues, this is a fairly complex topic, but the way the waste load allocations work is whatever you're allocated some amount, and then if you're under it, that's then there for you to trade. That can become a waste load allocation that you're able to trade. But there are some questions involving that. The state's pretty clear that there's no kind of property ownership instilled in the allocations, but there's still this trading mechanism. I think, at least from the people we've talked to, this is a fairly stable system in Virginia, but I think there's some benefits if the state could clarify who has ownership. It might give business some incentive and some assurance in investing in the area if they're having to rely on traded permits, because right now the waste loads are completely allocated such that if somebody's moving into the area, they're having to look to other businesses who are able to trade their waste load allocations if they need to have some discharge into the area. So who owns them? Just some assurance for the trading market would be beneficial. Another question that comes into this is, how is the EPA going to look at a project like this when they're assigning their next level of TMDL reductions? Does that get factored in? So all of those things are issues that kind of come up with the waste load allocations, and hopefully the panelists can address some of those. A little bit about the cost is, we mentioned the consent decree, and certainly the HRSD's position is that this project offers so much more benefit than a lot of, I guess, the non-critical parts of the consent decree, but there should be some discussion, I guess, about what we're losing. So what part of the consent decree is not going to be met or is going to be postponed until 2037? Is there a real loss there? Is that an issue? There doesn't appear to be any other great mechanisms for funding this, so we'd be losing a lot if we don't pursue this, or if the EPA doesn't grant that postponement of the consent decree requirements. The annual cost brings up another few interesting issues. It's been mentioned that this could maybe be passed on to permitted users in some way, that there could be an aquifer recharge fee to permitted users. And that's kind of an interesting idea, because we don't have, would that be volume-based? And Virginia doesn't have a volume-based system. And who is that going to be going to? Are we charging people who are using the water and have caused some of the issues in the past, or are the biggest withdrawers, or are we charging the people who are gaining the most benefit from it? So there's some interesting policy questions that come up with that. And also, there's a big segment of Virginia that's completely unpermitted. There's about a third of our water usage is unpermitted. So are they included in some type of aquifer recharge fee if that does get incorporated? Or are we just causing HRSD's customers to bear a benefit that actually extends well beyond their customer base? So those are some interesting questions that come up. I put on the slide, the potential benefits are pretty immense on a number of different fronts, and there's some big policy questions, but maybe the biggest thing is just how to get the public involved. Are they ready to drink wastewater? And to what level does education need to be presented to the public? And is there a fund for presenting the information to the public? So, and I guess the last point is there another alternative? These groundwater issues for Virginia are pretty immediate. The permit cuts, I think, is the first time big state users are really feeling the impact. But even with the permit cuts, as groundwater use goes up, it's going to be arduous for the state to keep up if there isn't something like an aquifer recharge program like this going on. And so hopefully that highlighted some of the issues, and I'm sure the panelists will address a number of them. And thank you very much.